The velvet case was heavier than it looked, and I had carried it through the staff corridor with both hands pressed flat against the lid, the way my grandmother once told me to carry anything that mattered more than my own safety. Inside lay the Veyr Ring, cushioned in gray silk, its crimson stone dark as dried wine. I had spent 6 weeks stabilizing the gold setting, replacing a hairline crack in the band with alloy, so precisely matched that even the royal jewelers could not find the seam. Tonight it would sit beside Princess Seraphine Valecrest on the dais of the Hall of Starlight, displayed for the midwinter succession banquet, like proof that 400 years of Valecrest rule still meant something. I wanted no part of the banquet itself. I was a conservator, not a courtier, and the sound of that many nobles laughing at once made my shoulders climb toward my ears. My plan was simple. Hand the case to the seneschal at the side door, murmur something appropriately deferential, and vanish back into the archive wing before anyone asked me a question I didn't want to answer. The plan lasted exactly as long as it took a nervous young attendant to come sprinting around the corner with an armful of table linens and collide with my shoulder. The case slipped. I lunged, caught it against my hip before it struck the marble, and in doing that, my glove tore against the corner of a doorframe. My bare fingers closed on gold. The ring went from cool to burning in the space of a single held breath. Not warm. Not the pleasant heat of metal left near a fire. It was pain, sharp and climbing, radiating up through my palm and into my wrist, and the crimson stone flared gold so bright, I saw the doorframe's shadow burned onto the inside of my eyelids when I blinked. Every enchanted chandelier in the Hall of Starlight went dark at once. 200 voices dropped into a single, confused silence, and then, high above the throne platform, the ancient royal crest carved into the ceiling, the one nobody living had ever seen lit, ignited in threads of gold that traced the shape of 2 crowns intertwined. I tried to drop the ring. My hand would not obey me. There was no physical force holding my fingers closed, nothing wrapped around my wrist, but the current running through my palm anchored me to the metal as surely as a nail through wood. Someone near the throne rose so fast her chair scraped a groove into the floor. I didn't need to be told who it was. Even from across a darkened ballroom, even through the panic closing my throat, I felt it, a scent reaching me the way cold reaches skin before you understand you've stepped outside. Rosemary sharpened by frost, old parchment, something like mountain air after snowfall, carrying a bitterness underneath that I would later learn was fear wearing the shape of control. My whole body responded to it, and it was not the helpless swoon the old ballads promised omegas would feel in the presence of a powerful alpha. It was recognition, immediate and unbearable, like meeting your own reflection in a stranger's face. "The ring chose her," someone whispered, and the words moved through the crowd faster than the princess could cross the floor toward me. "The Frost Princess has a mate." Guards began to converge from both ends of the hall, halberds catching what little light remained from the emergency lanterns someone had finally thought to bring. An elderly duchess near the front pressed a hand to her mouth. A foreign ambassador I recognized from the Western embassies was already scribbling something onto a folded card, no doubt the first draft of an urgent letter home. The king's voice cut across the room, hoarse with an authority he rarely had to raise, ordering every door sealed, and I understood with total clarity that I was about to become either a miracle or a prisoner, and possibly both before midnight. My grandmother had always warned me that the palace ate people who wandered too close to its center, and I had spent my whole career making sure I was never anything more than a pair of careful hands moving through its outer rooms. Now every eye in the Hall of Starlight had turned to find me standing in torn gloves beneath a ceiling that had not glowed in 100 years, and there was no archive deep enough to hide in anymore. Seraphine Valecrest stopped several feet away from me. I had seen portraits, the pale hair drawn back in a crown of braids, the eyes the color of a lake in the last hour before ice, but no portrait had ever caught the stillness of her. She did not reach for me. She did not reach for the ring. "May I touch it?" she asked. I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound I couldn't stop, because the most powerful alpha in the kingdom of Valadir was asking my permission in a hall full of people who would have handed her anything she wanted without being asked. "Yes," I said. because I couldn't think of any other answer, and because some part of me, the part still pressing burning gold into my own palm, wanted to know what would happen if she did. Seraphine set 2 fingers against the opposite curve of the ring. The stone did not merely flare this time, it broke. Light cracked the ceremonial glass surrounding the throne platform in a sound like a held breath finally released, and for one unbearable second I was not standing in the Hall of Starlight at all. I was somewhere with cold stone floors and candlelight, watching a woman with my own face kneel across from a royal alpha in unfamiliar armor, watching blood soak into flagstones, hearing someone sob the words "not again," never let the crown decide for her before the vision folded shut, like a hand closing. My knees went. I don't remember deciding to fall, only that I was falling, and that Seraphine crossed the last of the distance between us and caught me because I had, without meaning to, reached for her first. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. I woke to unfamiliar ceiling beams and the smell of old paper, which was, at least, a smell I trusted. The room was small and warm, lined with shelves of bound manuscripts, and when I pushed myself upright, I found the door standing open onto an empty corridor. No guard leaned against the frame. No lock waited on the outside. On the writing desk sat a folded page in a hand, so precise it looked engraved rather than written. It was an order signed and sealed, stating that no one, including the princess herself, was to enter this room without my expressed permission. I read it 3 times before I believed it meant what it said. Outside my window, I could hear the palace behaving like a struck hive. A steward passing in the hall was arguing with someone about whether I should be presented publicly before noon. Someone else insisted the succession announcement could not proceed until the ring's reaction was formally investigated by the College of Royal Historians. A third voice, thin with anger, said the Omega should simply be removed from the palace grounds before this became an international embarrassment. I sat with my knees drawn to my chest and pressed my thumb against the side of my index finger, an old habit from childhood, and tried to decide whether I was more frightened of the ring or of the woman who had touched it. Somewhere beneath the window, a bell tower struck an hour I didn't bother counting. I thought of my grandmother, 3 years gone now, who used to say that the palace collected people the way the harbor collected driftwood, indifferent to whether the wood had ever wanted to travel that far from shore. I thought of the vision, the woman with my face, the blood on the chapel stones, the voice begging that the crown never again be allowed to decide for someone else, and wondered whether I had just watched my own history or only borrowed someone else's grief for a moment, because the ring had nowhere else to put it. A tray of untouched food sat cooling on the desk beside my order of privacy, and I realized someone had thought to feed me, even in the middle of a full-court crisis, which told me more about the household staff's opinions than any of the rumors currently circulating below. She knocked, actually knocked, knuckles against wood, and waited until I said she could come in. Seraphine Valecrest, without an audience, looked younger than her portraits and older than her 34 years all at once. She had changed out of her ceremonial coat into something plainer, dark wool without a single crest sewn into it, and she stood just inside the doorway, as though she expected me to order her back out. "The ring may have recognized something," she said, without preamble, without asking how I felt, or offering false comfort first. "It has not made a decision for you." "Is that what you believe?" I asked, "or what you think I need to hear?" Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile. "I've spent 15 years being told I am incomplete because nothing ever reacted to me. I have no intention of telling someone else that a reaction means she no longer belongs to herself. It was not romantic. It was not even especially warm, but it was the first honest thing anyone in that palace had said to me since the chandeliers went dark, and it was enough to make me curious about her in a way I resented almost immediately. I stayed in the palace for the days that followed, not because anyone compelled me, Seraphine's written order extended, I discovered, to the front gate, where I could have walked out at any hour. But because the ring's reaction had triggered small magical disturbances across the city, cracked wardstones, flickering street lamps, and the royal historians needed someone who could read 400-year-old enchantment scripts without destroying them. That someone was me. I found her in my workshop past midnight on the third night, standing over a half-repaired family tree, with the wary posture of someone who had wandered into unfamiliar territory and was trying not to touch anything. "You could have sent a page," I said, not looking up from the parchment I was flattening under glass weights. I wanted to see the work. She peeled off her ceremonial gloves, an oddly vulnerable gesture, and reached for the corner of the manuscript I was steadying. "Tell me where to put my hands." "There." "No." I caught her wrist before her palm landed directly on a section of ink I'd spent 2 hours reviving. "There. That corner. The other one." She moved her hand exactly 1 inch to the left, which was still wrong, and I laughed before I could stop myself. The future Queen of Valadir, negotiator of border treaties, terror of feuding noble houses, could not follow the single instruction of holding a piece of paper flat. "I am capable of holding paper," she said, with the wounded dignity of someone who clearly was not, in this particular instance. "You are capable of many things. This isn't currently one of them." I guided her hand myself, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Her fingers cool under mine, and I understood that this, bent over old ink at midnight, teasing the most feared alpha in the kingdom about her terrible bedside manner with historical documents, was the first time I had seen her as a woman rather than a title. The breakfast the following morning was a different kind of education. I was seated at the edge of the royal family's table, close enough to be seen and far enough to be reminded of my place, and 3 separate nobles found reasons within the first quarter hour to mention how curious it was that a Harbor District Omega, with ink permanently staining her fingers, might someday represent the crown. Seraphine did not raise her voice. She dismantled each argument with the calm precision of someone taking apart a poorly built cabinet, citing the exact treaty clause that made one lord's objection legally irrelevant, noting the exact scandal that made another lady's family unsuited to lecture anyone about suitability. Then, instead of resting on her victory, she turned to me in front of the entire table and asked what I thought. I told them, at some length, that a kingdom which measured a person's worth by the calluses on her hands, rather than the accuracy of her work, had already answered its own question about what kind of ruler it deserved. The table went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. I was impressed by her. I was also irritated that she was so good at controlling a room that I hadn't noticed she'd handed the room to me on purpose. She showed me the falconry courtyard 2 days later, tucked behind the western wall, where the wind came off the mountains instead of the sea. An old hunting bird sat hooded on a low perch, one wing set at a permanent angle, and the falconer told me in a low voice that the bird trusted almost no one and had nearly been put down twice. Seraphine crouched beside it without ceremony and spoke to it in a register I had not heard her use with any human being. When she offered me the glove, I expected the bird to bolt. Instead, it settled, talons closing with careful precision, and watched me with one dark, assessing eye. "She likes you," Seraphine said, and there was something in her voice, surprise, maybe, or envy, that told me the bird's trust was rarer than mine. Late that same week, unable to sleep, I found her in the royal kitchens, stealing bread directly from the cooling racks, with the guilty economy of movement of someone who had done this before. "Dinner was interrupted by council business," she admitted, when I raised an eyebrow. "This happens more often than the royal physicians would like. Ruling a kingdom while starving yourself is an inefficient use of a kingdom," I told her, and took half the loaf for myself before she could eat all of it. And for the first time, our conversation had nothing to do with rings or crowns or bloodlines at all. It was on one of those quiet nights that I finally asked her the question I'd been circling for a week. Did you ever actually want a mate? Or did you stop letting yourself want one? She considered this longer than the question seemed to warrant. I wanted someone who would have stayed, if I had been born with nothing. Everyone who has ever approached me arrived already knowing what I was. I have never once known whether I was wanted or simply won. I understood, in that moment, that her fear ran nearly opposite to mine. I was afraid of being owned by her power. She was afraid that nothing about her, apart from her power, had ever been chosen. Neither fear was foolish. Both, I was beginning to suspect, were about to become considerably more complicated to manage. She told me the rest of it in pieces, over several nights, the way people tell you things they've never said out loud before, and are testing to see whether the words still hold their shape once spoken. At 19, she had stood through months of formal compatibility ceremonies. More than 200 eligible omegas and betas, from every noble house in Valadיר, presented before her, one by one, like items on an inventory. The ring had stayed cold through every single one. The broadsheets had taken to calling her hollow-blooded within the year, a phrase she repeated to me with no inflection at all, which told me exactly how many times she'd had to hear it before she stopped flinching. There had been a noblewoman once, years later, whom Seraphine had genuinely cared for, enough to imagine, briefly, a life outside council chambers and treaty negotiations. The woman had eventually admitted, without much shame, that her family had encouraged the courtship purely on the chance that Seraphine might someday sit the throne. And after that had come the worst incident, the one Seraphine told me about only once and never again. An Omega who had used illegal scent alchemy to manufacture a false compatibility reaction, hoping to force the ring's hand through chemistry rather than truth. The attempt had failed, but it had cost Seraphine something no council session ever could. She stopped trusting the sensation of wanting someone at all, because she could no longer tell the difference between genuine desire and a well-constructed lie. It became simpler, she told me, staring at the middle distance the way she did whenever a subject cost her more than she wanted to show, to let people want the crown instead. At least then I understood exactly what they were reaching for. The royal historians eventually let me examine the ring's original enchantment script, buried under 3 later layers of amended text, each layer more restrictive than the last. What I found rewrote everything the kingdom believed about its own crown jewel. The ring did not identify fated ownership. It required mutual willingness, 2 people choosing to move toward each other, freely, before the stone would respond at all. Pull away, and the reaction faded. It could not compel touch. It could not manufacture desire from nothing. It had been built, deliberately, as protection against forced royal bonding, not as its instrument. Certain religious officials, I discovered with some bitterness, had been telling a very different story for generations, one considerably more convenient for arranging marriages between powerful families. We spent 3 long evenings in the old royal library, cross-referencing the enchantment script against council records dating back centuries, Seraphine perched on the edge of a reading table, in a way no portrait would ever have permitted, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, ink smudged along the side of her hand from where she'd insisted on taking her own notes, rather than dictating to a scribe. She had a scholar's patience once she committed to a question, methodical in a way that surprised me, until I remembered that treaty negotiation was, in its own fashion, just another kind of translation work, finding the true meaning buried under generations of careful phrasing, designed to obscure it. "Here," she said one night, tapping a passage in a chancellor's ledger from 200 years earlier, an amendment restricting the ring's display to formal ceremonies only. Why would anyone bother legislating that unless they were worried about what might happen if it were touched somewhere informal, where no one could control the story afterward? "Because informal is where truth tends to happen," I said, and she looked up at me for a long moment before returning to the page, and I understood that some quiet recalibration had taken place behind her eyes, the kind that doesn't announce itself but changes the temperature of a room regardless. I felt the truth of the ring's design myself one evening in the palace greenhouse, where I had gone to escape a headache and instead found myself lightheaded in a way that had nothing to do with the humidity. Weeks of proximity to dormant bond magic, the healer later explained, had triggered an early stress response. Not a true heat, but close enough to frighten me badly, my skin too warm, the edges of the room swimming. Palace tradition, I would learn afterward, held that an alpha princess had every right to provide direct stabilization to a possible mate in that condition. Seraphine ordered everyone else from the room and then, instead of remaining, turned to leave herself. "Why are you going?" I managed. "Because you are frightened," she said, "and I refuse to let your body answer a question you haven't." I asked her to stay. She stopped a full room's width away. I asked her to come closer, and she did. Slow enough that I had time to change my mind at every step and didn't. I asked permission to take her hand, which made something almost like a laugh escape her. The reversal was not lost on either of us, and she said yes. We sat together beneath the greenhouse windows while snow gathered on the glass, her scent settling around me like a weighted blanket, warm parchment and rosemary, and something underneath that I would later learn was simply her, unguarded. The panic in my chest unwound slowly, thread by thread, until I could hear the small, ordinary sounds of the greenhouse again. Water dripping from an overturned watering can, wind testing the seams of the glass roof, her own breathing, even and careful, as though she were holding herself deliberately still so as not to startle whatever fragile thing was settling between us. I asked her, half drowsy, whether this was what the old ballads meant by stabilization, and she said, dryly, that the old ballads had left out the part where the alpha in question spent the entire encounter terrified of moving wrong. Nothing more happened. I fell asleep against her shoulder somewhere before midnight. When I woke, the greenhouse windows were pale with early light, and she was still there, arm gone stiff from holding its position all night, and had not moved. "You could have shifted," I told her, working feeling back into my own fingers. "I didn't want to wake you to ask permission for something as small as that," she said, which was, I would come to learn, entirely typical of her, and entirely maddening. The trip to the coastal estate happened almost by accident. I had learned that my grandmother's old house, abandoned since her death, might hold papers belonging to my mother, who had vanished when I was 6 years old under circumstances no one in my family had ever fully explained. Seraphine offered to accompany me, ostensibly for security, and we set out with 2 guards who peeled off at the last village, at Seraphine's quiet instruction, so that we arrived at the ruined estate essentially alone. We were still searching through waterlogged trunks when the storm rolled in off the water hard enough to strand us for the night. There was one usable bedroom in the whole crumbling house. Seraphine announced she would sleep downstairs before I had finished suggesting it myself, which annoyed me more than it should have. "You don't have to keep doing that," I told her, following her down the narrow stairs with a lamp. "Doing what?" "Handling me like something that might shatter if you stand too close." I hadn't meant to say it with quite that much heat, but the words were already out. "I am not fragile, Seraphine." She turned, and for once I watched her composure genuinely crack. "I know exactly how not fragile you are. That isn't why I keep my distance." A pause, longer than any pause she'd allowed herself all week. "I want you badly enough that it frightens me. Restraint isn't the absence of wanting you. It's the only method I have of making certain you can trust the wanting, when it comes." I crossed the space between us and kissed her, because there was nothing else left to say that would have said it better. She went still with surprise for exactly 1 heartbeat before she asked, against my mouth, whether I was certain. "Yes," I said, and meant it entirely, and she kissed me again, like a woman finally permitted to want something out loud. The house rattled with wind and rain around us for the rest of the night. We stayed downstairs by the fire, wrapped in old blankets that smelled of dust and salt, trading soft kisses and quieter confessions. She told me about the first time she'd flown a hawk as a child, and broken her wrist catching it wrong, and how her father had made her return to the mews the following morning, rather than let the fear settle in. I told her about my grandmother teaching me to read cracked ink under candlelight because we couldn't afford proper lamps, and how I'd fallen in love with the work before I understood it might someday be a career at all. Somewhere past midnight, she fell quiet, watching the fire, and admitted that she could not remember the last time she had told anyone a true story about herself, without calculating, first, what that story might cost her later. I told her this one was free. She laughed, low and surprised, and kissed my temple, and nothing about the night needed to go further than that, to feel like the truest thing either of us had done in years. I woke before dawn to find her already awake beside me, watching the gray light climb the walls, and for a moment neither of us spoke, content simply to exist in the same small circle of warmth, while the storm outside wound itself down to nothing. We found my mother's letters the following morning, hidden inside a false panel behind the pantry shelves. Evelyn Elwyn, historian by training, had uncovered, long before I was born, the true story buried beneath the Veyr Ring's public legend, a queen named Althea who had loved an Omega healer named Leora Marin, a bond the noble houses had tried to dissolve because it threatened their control over the royal bloodline, a ring that had refused to be forced and had instead gone silent to the entire royal line rather than reward coercion. Queen Althea had altered the enchantment so that no future heir could activate it again, unless a descendant of Leora's own line touched it freely. I was descended from Leora Marin. My mother had known it. And she had disappeared, the letters made clear, specifically to keep that fact buried, and her daughter unknown to a court that would have made a political weapon of both. The last letter in the bundle was addressed to no one, written, I suspected, in a moment when my mother needed to steady her own hand, rather than send a message anywhere. It described a woman she had once loved from a distance, without ever speaking to her. Queen Althea, dead centuries before either of them were born, known to my mother only through the fragments of record that had survived the crown's deliberate erasures. She wrote that she understood, reading between Althea's careful lines, exactly what it cost a person to love someone the world had decided they weren't permitted to keep. She wrote that she hoped, whatever she had to sacrifice to protect it, her daughter would never have to learn that particular lesson firsthand. I sat on the floor of that ruined pantry, with the letter shaking gently in my hands, and thought of every birthday I had spent believing my mother simply hadn't wanted to stay. Seraphine read the letters over my shoulder in silence, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone carefully flat in the way I now recognized as the sound of her trying not to feel something too large to show me yet. Someone in my own court has spent generations making sure I never learned this. A pause, and something harder settled into her jaw, and someone is very likely still working to keep it that way. We did not have to search far to find out who. Lady Isolde Varin, the Lord Chancellor, had raised Seraphine since her mother's death, and loved her, I came to understand, with the fierce and airless love of someone who believed protecting a person meant deciding everything on her behalf. Isolde's family had controlled royal marriages for generations, through careful arrangement of exactly which bloodlines were permitted anywhere near the crown. The rediscovery of the ring's true purpose threatened all of it. She did not seem evil when I finally met her, only certain, in the particular way of people who have convinced themselves that cruelty performed for the sake of stability isn't cruelty at all. Isolde received me in her private study a week after the coastal trip, ostensibly to discuss the historical findings, and offered me tea with the same brisk warmth she might have shown any promising young scholar summoned for an audience. She was handsome, in a severe way, silver threading through dark hair pulled back tight enough to suggest discipline as a personal philosophy, rather than merely a habit, and she watched me over the rim of her cup with an attention that missed nothing. "You understand what you represent," she said without preamble, "whether or not you intended to represent anything at all." "I understand what people have decided I represent," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." Something that might have been respect flickered across her face before it smoothed away again. "I raised Seraphine from the time she was 11 years old. I have watched this kingdom survive border wars, 2 famines, and a regency crisis that nearly split it in half. And I have watched every one of those disasters resolve, because the crown's marriages were arranged with enough foresight to prevent them. You are asking me to believe that 400 years of careful stewardship should bow to a feeling. I'm not asking you to believe anything," I told her. "I'm telling you what the ring's own inscription says, in its own words, before anyone amended it to suit your family's preferences." She set her cup down with exact, unhurried precision, the sound of porcelain against saucer somehow louder than it should have been. "Be careful, Miss Elwyn. I do love my niece. I would very much prefer not to become your enemy over this. But I have spent my life ensuring this throne survives, and I will not watch it destabilized because a conservator with ink-stained hands touched the wrong ring on the wrong night." I left her study with the distinct sense that I had just been warned rather than merely spoken to, and I was right. For a while, none of that mattered as much as it should have, because we were happy. I moved back to my own small apartment in the palace quarter, refusing the grander rooms offered to me, and Seraphine began arriving in the evenings without her guards, ducking under my low doorway and complaining, with real offense, about the size of my kitchen. I taught her to make soup. She chopped vegetables with the exact, joyless precision of a woman executing a military maneuver. And when I laughed at her, she eventually laughed too, low and surprised, as though laughter were a language she was only now remembering how to speak. We walked through a winter festival once in plain clothes, unrecognized, and I watched her absorb her own capital the way a starving person watches a meal, merchants haggling, children fighting with wooden swords, an old woman complaining loudly about grain taxes, without any idea the crown itself stood 3 feet away listening. A puppeteer near the fountain was performing some exaggerated version of the succession banquet for a delighted crowd of children, complete with a crude wooden ring that shrieked and smoked when the puppet princess touched it, and Seraphine laughed so hard at her own caricature that she had to lean against a nearby wall to recover, tears standing in her eyes, while I stood beside her trying and failing to look scandalized on the crown's behalf. "They think I'm terrifying," she said, wiping her eyes, nodding toward the puppet's exaggerated scowl. "You are terrifying," I said, just also, apparently, capable of finding it funny. Seraphine bought me a carved wooden bird from a street vendor, instead of anything with a jewel in it, small and unpolished, one wing slightly uneven where the carver's knife had slipped, and told me, with unexpected shyness, that she'd wanted to give me something that was simply mine, with no crest and no history attached, to make it belong to anyone else first. I kept it on my windowsill from that day forward, and it would still be there, worn smooth from handling, long after everything else in this story had changed. On a night when she came back from council looking hollowed out, jaw tight from some argument I could tell she'd won and hated winning, I sat her down and brushed the tangles from her hair in silence, and for once, she let herself be handled without offering a single argument about it, eyes closed, shoulders finally unlocking from wherever she carried the weight of the kingdom during the day. I found, working through the careful braids the palace stylists set each morning, that I liked this best of everything we did together. Not the kisses, not the quiet nights in the greenhouse, but this, the simple domestic permission to care for her without either of us needing to perform anything for anyone watching. "I don't know what kind of queen I want to be," she admitted once, eyes still closed, voice gone soft with exhaustion. "I know what my father expects. I know what Isolde has spent 30 years preparing me to become. I am not certain any of that was ever actually a choice." "You're allowed to decide that," I told her, working a final knot loose. "Not just inherit an answer." We argued, once, half seriously, about whether the ring had chosen the single worst possible moment in either of our lives to make itself known. A fortnight before a critical border treaty renewal, in the middle of a banquet meant to steady a nervous kingdom, in front of every foreign dignitary capable of turning the news into a diplomatic incident. 400 years of dormancy, I told her, and it couldn't have picked a Tuesday afternoon with no one watching. "I don't believe the ring consults calendars," Seraphine said, entirely straight-faced, "though I would very much like to file a formal complaint if it does." It was the kind of joke that only worked because we had both, somewhere in the preceding weeks, stopped being careful with each other, and I understood, turning it over afterward, that the audience watching us fall in love would have believed it regardless of whether any ring existed at all. It should have stayed that way. It didn't. The evidence appeared within a fortnight, documents suggesting I had known about my ancestry long before the banquet, a payment recorded under my grandmother's name from years past, a witness who swore I had asked pointed questions about royal mate law months before the ring ever burned. It was thorough. It was convincing. Even the servants who had liked me began keeping their distance in the corridors. Seraphine asked me, gently at first and then less gently, whether there was anything I hadn't told her. There was. Buried among my grandmother's papers, I had found a second, more recent letter, unsigned, but unmistakably my mother's careful hand, hinting that she might still be alive, hidden under another name somewhere near the border, waiting until it was safe to be found. I had promised myself, reading it, that I would say nothing to anyone until I understood why she had vanished at all, not even to Seraphine, because some old, protective instinct told me that the moment I spoke it aloud in the palace, it would stop being mine to investigate quietly and become instead another piece of evidence for the court to fight over. "There's nothing I haven't told you," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I felt them land wrong, too fast, too careful in their construction. Seraphine, who had spent her entire adult life reading rooms for exactly this kind of falseness, who had built an entire political career on knowing precisely when someone across a table was lying to her, set her cup down with a control that told me more than any accusation could have. "You're lying to me," she said. Not an accusation shouted across the room. Worse, a simple, exhausted observation, the tone of someone confirming a fear rather than discovering a new one. "It isn't what you think." "I don't know what to think anymore, Mira." That's rather the problem. She had gone pale in the particular way I now recognized as the sign that she was holding something enormous perfectly still behind her ribs. "The council has forged evidence sitting on my desk, suggesting you knew exactly what would happen the night you touched that ring. I have spent 3 days telling every one of them that they are wrong, that I know you, that you would never, and now you are standing in front of me refusing to tell me something you are very obviously hiding. It has nothing to do with the ring, or the forgeries, or any of it. Then tell me what it has to do with." I could not yet. Not until I understood it myself, not until I knew whether the woman who had written that letter wanted to be found at all, and my silence, stretching 1 second too long, answered a question neither of us had actually asked out loud. "Perhaps," Seraphine said, very quietly, the words coming out of her like something breaking loose from a long way down. "The ring only made me believe I felt something that was never real. Perhaps that would at least make sense of why every instinct I have ever trusted has apparently been wrong about you." Something in me, hearing that, simply stopped trying to explain. My hands had gone cold, despite the fire still burning in the grate. I took the small carved bird from where it sat on my windowsill and set it on the table between us, deliberately, the way you set down something you no longer trust yourself to keep holding. "The ring was the first thing that ever chose me without asking what I could offer in return," I told her. "I thought you were going to be the first person." Her expression cracked at that, just barely, the composure she wore like armor slipping enough that I saw, underneath it, exactly how frightened she actually was. But she did not take it back. She stood there, with the accusation still hanging unretracted in the air between us, and I understood that whatever she felt for me had, in this moment, lost a war against 15 years of learning not to trust her own instincts. "I need you to leave," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, and I couldn't tell, walking out, whether she meant the room or something larger than the room. She did not stop me when I left. I have thought, many times since, that this hurt her as much as anything Isolde ever engineered, that she let me go because some old, wounded part of her still expected everyone to leave eventually, and my leaving simply confirmed what she already believed about herself. The Veyr Ring went completely black within the hour. The court took this as proof I had been false all along. Seraphine understood it differently, and far more painfully, the ring had only ever answered mutual willingness, and it had gone dark because I no longer trusted her enough to reach for it, or for her. She sent no guards after me. No summons arrived at my door. She announced, publicly and at considerable political cost, that I owed the crown nothing, which triggered exactly the kind of crisis you'd expect when a future queen dismantles centuries of mate doctrine in a single sentence. When she reached out once, quietly, asking only to speak, I asked for space, and she gave it to me without argument, which somehow hurt worse than if she had fought for less. I went back to the harbor district and did what I do best. I did not wait for anyone to solve this for me. The forged documents, once I had them in proper light and my own tools, gave themselves away within an hour. A pigment invented no more than 8 years ago, its mineral signature unmistakable under a simple oil test, used to age paper meant to look 4 decades old. Whoever had commissioned the forgery had been careful about the handwriting and careless about the chemistry, which told me they had hired a skilled forger and a mediocre historian, and that particular combination narrowed the list of likely patrons considerably. The false payment led, through 3 layers of shipping guild records and a flooded harbor archive where I ruined a perfectly good pair of boots wading through ledger rooms, to a company quietly owned by Isolda's own family, under a name obscure enough that only someone who spent her days tracing old signatures would have recognized the connection. The witness against me, a minor clerk who had sworn under oath that I'd asked him pointed questions about royal mate law months before the banquet, drew his wages from that same company, a fact he had apparently not expected anyone to bother checking. Tessa Rowan, a fellow conservator with more patience for tedious paperwork than I have ever possessed, helped me trace all of it, uncomplaining through every dead end. We searched an abandoned customs chapel where half the old maritime records had been left to rot under a collapsed section of roof, and it was there, wedged behind a loose stone in what had once been a confessional, that we found a hidden compartment holding one final letter in my grandmother's own hand, addressed to a monastery near the northern border and never sent. "She was going to tell you," Tessa said, reading over my shoulder. "Eventually, she just ran out of time." That letter led us north, 3 days of hard travel through country, turning white with early snow, to a stone monastery perched above a river gorge, where a woman with my exact gray-green eyes answered the door of a small guest cell, wearing the plain robes of a lay sister, and went the color of old paper the moment she saw my face. Mira, just my name, nothing else, as though 2 decades hadn't passed since she'd last had occasion to say it. We sat across a narrow table while she told me the rest of it, how she had uncovered the truth about Leora Marin, buried in a set of monastery archives she'd been cataloging as a young historian, how she'd understood, reading between the crown's careful erasures, exactly what our family's blood meant to anyone powerful enough to weaponize it, how she had disappeared rather than risk her daughter becoming a political instrument before she was even old enough to understand what that meant. She did not apologize the way I wanted her to. She said, simply, that she had saved my life, and seemed to believe that settled the matter entirely. "You saved my life," I told her, and left a child who spent 21 years believing her own mother hadn't wanted her badly enough to stay. I watched something in her face crumple at that, slow and complete, the particular collapse of someone recognizing a mistake only after it can no longer be undone. Protection without truth isn't protection, Mother. It's just a different kind of abandonment, dressed up nicer. She did not argue with me. She only reached across the narrow table and took my hand, the way she must have done 1,000 times when I was small enough not to remember it, and said she would come back with me, if I would let her, and tell the entire kingdom the truth herself, rather than let me carry the weight of proving it alone. I recognized, watching her, exactly the same flawed logic Seraphine had used against me in that workshop, the conviction that deciding for someone else, even out of love, was somehow gentler than trusting them with a difficult truth. It would take me longer than I expected to fully forgive either of them for it. While I was gathering evidence in the harbor and the monastery, Isolda was busy in the capital. She brought the council to a decision point. Seraphine would formally reject me and accept an arranged marriage to secure the succession, or she would surrender her place in it entirely. Seraphine surrendered the throne, not as a bargaining move, not as some grand romantic gesture engineered to win me back. She did it, I would later learn, believing she might never see me again, because keeping the crown at the cost of making me the crown's property was a bargain she finally, completely, refused to make. I heard her announcement on the road back from the monastery, relayed secondhand by a nervous innkeeper who kept a broadsheet folded behind his bar and read it aloud to us twice, because he couldn't quite believe what he was repeating either time. Seraphine had stood before the full council according to the printed transcript, and told them that a crown requiring its heir to reject a person she loved in order to keep it was not a crown worth the cost of keeping. She said that no ring, no bloodline, no parliament, and no throne held the authority to assign one grown woman to another, that Valadir's laws had confused ownership with stability for 400 years and called it tradition, and that she would rather leave the succession to her cousin than spend the rest of her life ruling a kingdom built on that particular lie. The innkeeper's wife, refilling our cups, said she'd wept reading it, and that half the harbor district had done the same. I felt something in my chest that had been clenched since the night I walked out of that workshop finally begin, carefully, to loosen, though it would be another 2 days of hard travel before I trusted the feeling enough to act on it. I did not run into her arms when I returned. We met privately first, in the same workshop where she had once failed spectacularly at holding a piece of paper flat. She apologized, and it was not vague. She named, precisely, what she had done wrong, that she had asked me for honesty, and then let her own fear turn my silence into a verdict against me, that loving me had never entitled her to assume the worst the moment betrayal frightened her. She did not ask to be forgiven. She only said it, plainly, and waited. I told her why I had lied, and did not apologize for needing time to understand my mother's choices before I could share them. We agreed, standing there among the half-repaired manuscripts, that we had both chosen silence to protect each other, and that silence had nearly cost us everything it was meant to save. "Did you truly give up the throne?" I asked. "Yes. Knowing I might never come back." Yes, she did not flinch from the admission, though it clearly cost her something to make it. I told myself, standing in front of that council, that I would rather be a woman you might someday choose to forgive than a queen who had made that choice impossible for you in the first place. "And if I never choose you again?" "Then you remain free," she said without hesitation. And that, more than any declaration of love she could have offered, was what finally undid the last of my defenses. Not a promise that everything would be fine, not a plea, just the plain, unglamorous truth that she had already decided my freedom mattered more than her own certainty, and had acted on it before knowing whether it would ever be returned. I took her hand. Across the room, untouched, the Veyr Ring began to glow again, faint gold seeping back into stone that had been black for weeks. Neither of us looked at it. We looked at each other first, which mattered more than either of us said aloud, and when she kissed me, it tasted like every apology neither of us had needed to finish speaking. The final reckoning happened in the Hall of Petitions, the old chamber built centuries ago so ordinary citizens could address the crown directly, which I chose deliberately because the ring's original purpose had been about exactly that kind of freedom. I laid it all before the assembled nobles, guildmasters, military commanders, and citizens who had crowded in to watch. The restored original inscription proving the ring answered mutual consent rather than ownership, the evidence of Leora Marin's deliberate erasure from royal history, the modern pigment in the forged documents, the shipping records tying false testimony directly to Isolde's family, my mother's own account of what she had uncovered decades earlier. Seraphine testified beside me and did not spare herself. She told the hall, without flinching, that she had doubted me when it mattered most, that fear had made her cruel to the one person who had never once asked her for anything a crown could buy, and that admission shook the room harder than any polished defense could have. I watched several nobles who had spent weeks whispering about my unsuitability go quiet, recalculating, the way people do when a story they'd already decided how to feel about suddenly refuses to behave the way they expected. Isolde defended herself with real intelligence, unwilling to concede a single point without a fight. She argued that a monarchy could not survive heirs who placed personal want above political necessity, that 400 years of careful marriages had prevented wars this hall had conveniently forgotten to fear, and that foreign courts were already circling Seraphine's abdication like gulls over a wreck, ready to exploit any weakness the crown showed the world. "Sentiment," she said, turning to address the full assembly, rather than just the throne, "makes for lovely ballads and terrible statecraft. Love is a luxury a ruling house cannot afford, however much we might wish otherwise." "Then explain," I said, before Seraphine could answer for herself, "why the ring itself was built to refuse exactly the kind of statecraft you're describing. Someone 400 years ago already had this argument, Lady Isolde. Queen Althea lost the person she loved to it, and rewrote her own family's magic, rather than let the same theft happen twice. You didn't inherit a tradition, you inherited a cover-up, and you have spent your career protecting it, because the alternative required admitting your family profited from a lie." The hall erupted into overlapping argument, guildmasters and clergy and minor nobility, all trying to be heard over one another. and it took the king himself rapping his staff against the dais floor to restore enough quiet for Isolde to answer. "A kingdom," Seraphine said into that quiet, her voice carrying without needing to rise, "that requires its people to surrender themselves in order to preserve it, has already told you what it deserves to become. I would rather rule nothing at all than rule that." Isolde, desperate now, seized the ring from where it lay on the petitioner's table, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. "If this bond is truly what she claims," she said, holding it aloft for the entire hall to see, "then let it prove itself without theater. Let her activate it alone, without my niece's touch, and show us all that this was ever anything more than an elaborate manipulation of a lonely woman's hopes." She thrust the ring toward me. I took it. I held the cold gold in my palm, aware of every eye in the hall of petitions fixed on my hand, aware of my own pulse loud enough to hear, and willed it to warm the way it had warmed in that ballroom months ago. Nothing happened. The stone stayed dark, dull crimson, inert as any ordinary jewel, and for one terrible second, I watched doubt flicker across faces that had only just begun to believe me. "There," Isolde said, triumph sharpening her voice. "You see? Whatever happened at that banquet, it was never about me alone," I said, cutting through the rising murmur before it could take hold. "That's exactly the point you've spent your entire career making sure this kingdom never understood." I set the ring down on the petitioner's table, rather than continuing to hold it, and turned to face the assembly directly. "The original inscription doesn't name a bloodline. It doesn't name an heir. It describes a bond freely answered on both sides at once. I cannot make it answer alone any more than a conversation can happen with only one person speaking. That was never a flaw in the ring's design, Lady Isolde. It was the entire design." I set the ring down and did not touch it. I looked at Seraphine instead. She crossed toward me and stopped, deliberately, a full stride away, leaving the final distance to me. I closed it myself, and together we touched the ring. It did not burn this time. It warmed, slow and golden, the crimson stone clearing to something closer to sunlight than blood, and above us the old ceiling inscription revealed itself in full for the first time in centuries. Not a decree of ownership, but a single line of ancient script that resolved, roughly, into "Let the crown witness what the heart has freely answered." The kingdom did not restore everything overnight, and I was glad of it, because some things deserve to be rebuilt slowly, rather than simply returned to where they broke. Seraphine remained outside the succession for a time, while the council debated new laws to replace the old, coerced doctrine. Public opinion turned steadily in her favor, precisely because she had surrendered power, rather than misuse it. Her cousin, expected to inherit in her place, refused publicly to participate in any system built on Isolde's methods, which did more to shame the old guard than 100 council speeches could have. Isolde was stripped of her chancellorship within the month, though the king, mindful of 30 years of genuine service alongside the harm, allowed her to retire quietly to her family estates, rather than face the harsher judgment several council members demanded. Seraphine visited her there once, alone, and never told me exactly what was said, only that she had gone needing to say goodbye to the version of her aunt who had taught her to ride and stayed up with her through childhood fevers, separate from the woman who had nearly destroyed everything to protect a system that had never deserved the protecting. Eventually, the king offered Seraphine her place back, under laws rewritten to make coercion structurally impossible rather than merely discouraged, the compatibility ceremonies abolished entirely, the old mate doctrine rewritten from its recovered original text, every future heirs bond required to pass through the same standard of mutual willingness the ring had been built to protect in the first place. She told me she would only accept if I understood that becoming her consort would never require me to become decorative, a ceremonial fixture wheeled out for state occasions and otherwise expected to disappear. I told her I had no intention of becoming decorative for anyone, and that I intended to found an independent royal archive dedicated to restoring the records of erased commoners, omegas, and anyone else the old court had found politically inconvenient to remember. Leora Marin's name would only be the first of many. She accepted before I finished the sentence. We did not rush from that victory into a wedding. Trust, I had learned, was not a single decision, but a habit built through months of small, deliberate choices. Seraphine sometimes caught herself mid-sentence, halfway through deciding something on my behalf, and stopped herself before finishing it. I learned, slowly, to ask for what I needed, instead of retreating the moment I felt her authority pressing too close. We argued. We apologized. We built something sturdier than either of us had managed alone. She left restoration tools scattered across her once immaculate private library, and never once complained, though I caught her, more than once, quietly reorganizing them into some private system of order the moment she thought I wasn't looking. She learned, on the rare mornings that allowed it, to sleep past dawn, something I gathered she hadn't done since childhood, and the first time it happened she woke in something close to panic, convinced she'd missed an entire council session, before I talked her back down with tea, and the reminder that the kingdom had, in fact, survived without her for exactly 4 extra hours. I discovered, entirely by accident while searching for a missing ledger, a drawer full of embarrassingly sentimental poetry in her handwriting, which she insisted for a full week belonged to someone else. A cousin, she claimed, unconvincingly, though we both knew no cousin existed who wrote quite so specifically about gray-green eyes and ink-stained fingers, before finally admitting, read to the ears in a way I found entirely too satisfying, that it was hers. I made her read one aloud. She refused for 3 days and then did it anyway. Badly. And I told her it was terrible and beautiful and asked for another. The old hunting falcon retired to a perch outside my archive courtyard window, and, against all odds, seemed to prefer it there, screeching irritably at anyone but the two of us who dared approach too closely. Seraphine began walking through the harbor district without disguising herself at all, buying bread from the same stall twice a week, arguing cheerfully with the baker about prices in a way no Valecrest had done in living memory, and I watched the district slowly stop treating her arrival as an event and start treating it, instead, as simply Tuesday. My mother settled eventually in the capital, close enough that we could rebuild what the years had cost us, in small, deliberate increments rather than all at once. She and Seraphine were awkward with each other for months, 2 women who had each, in their own fashion, decided silence was a form of love, before they finally found their footing over an argument about, of all things, the proper method for cataloging damaged correspondence, which somehow resolved into the beginning of something like friendship. She brought me to the coastal chapel from the vision the night she finally proposed. The same stone floor, restored now, the names of Queen Althea and Leora Marin carved back into the wall where they had been chiseled away generations before, fresh gold leaf catching the last of the evening light through windows we had personally overseen the repair of. She had arranged for no guards, no attendants, nothing, but the 2 of us and the sound of the sea below the cliffs, exactly as it had been the night the storm first trapped us there. She did not offer me the Veyr Ring. She had commissioned something else entirely, a plain band from the same harbor jeweler who had once sold me a wooden bird for a few coppers, no crest, no magic, no 400 years of complicated history attached to it at all, just gold, shaped simply, chosen for no reason, beyond the fact that she thought I would like it. "I wanted your answer to belong only to you," she said, kneeling in a way I suspected no Valecrest had knelt to anyone in centuries. Her composure, that famous, unshakable composure the entire kingdom had built a legend around, finally, thoroughly abandoning her, not to the ring, not to the crown, not to anything either of us inherited without choosing it, only to you, and to me, and to whatever we decide to build between the 2 of us from here. She asked me to marry her in a voice that shook slightly despite, she admitted afterward when I teased her mercilessly about it, 27 separate rehearsals in front of a very patient falcon who offered no useful feedback whatsoever. I said yes before she'd fully finished the question, which meant she had to ask me to let her finish anyway, because she'd apparently written more of the speech and refused to let a small technicality like my answer stop her from delivering all of it. Seraphine's coronation filled the Hall of Starlight with more light than it had held on the night the ring first burned, though, this time, none of the chandeliers flickered. Tradition demanded that I kneel and place the ring on her hand. We rewrote that part of the ceremony together. Neither of us knelt. I placed the ring in her palm, and she immediately placed it back in mine, because the crown could keep it, but neither of us intended to belong to it. Later, long after the ceremony had emptied into feasting and the halls had quieted, we escaped together to the palace roof, climbing the same narrow service stairs I'd once used to avoid an entire ballroom full of nobles, and Seraphine pulled off her crown the moment we were alone and rubbed at the headache it had clearly been giving her for hours. I laughed, and she laughed with me, and we sat together on the cold stone with a blanket stolen from the nearest guest room, looking out over a city neither of us had to pretend not to love, its lamplit streets spreading out toward a harbor I could have found blindfolded. "Your father asked me today whether I regretted any of it," Seraphine said, turning the crown over in her hands like an object she still hadn't quite decided how to hold. "The abdication, the scandal, all of it." "What did you tell him?" "That I regretted exactly none of it, and that if the ring had to burn to teach this kingdom the difference between destiny and consent, I would let it burn every century if that was what it took." She set the crown down between us, an oddly casual gesture for something so heavily freighted with history, and reached instead for my hand, though I would prefer, selfishly, that it only ever needed to happen once. I thought about the girl who had once believed that magical mate legends were nothing but old tools nobles used to justify their marriages, and I thought she had been half right. The legend itself had been corrupted for exactly that purpose, generation after generation, until almost no one remembered what it had originally meant. It had never promised that I belonged to Seraphine. It had only ever opened a door and left the walking through of it entirely up to me. I reached for her hand, and where the ring had once scorched my palm hard enough to leave a mark I could still trace on quiet nights, it now sat cool and quiet against my skin. The warmth, when it came from somewhere else entirely, from Seraphine's fingers closing slowly around mine, the way they had every night since, and the way, I understood now, they intended to for a very long time to come.